Ever feel like when you look at the world of video games, it's just this massive, sprawling thing? Like, where do you even begin to understand what's what?
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming. There's just so much out there.
Well, that's exactly why we're here today. We're going to pull out the map, so to speak, and really take a deep dive into video game genres. Figure out what makes each one tick.
Exactly. We've got this really incredible set of resources here, super comprehensive. And what we really want to do is distill all this knowledge into something clear and insightful for you, help you make sense of this whole landscape.
Yeah. So we're not going to get bogged down in, whether a game has zombies or spaceships or whatever. We're going to go deeper than that. Get to the heart of how these games actually play.
That's the key, right? It's not about the setting or the story. It's about the core mechanics, what you, the player, are actually doing.
It's like you could have, say, a first-person shooter, right? You see the world through your character's eyes and you're shooting at things, but it doesn't matter if those things are aliens or robots or orcs. The fundamental experience is the same. That's what makes it a first-person shooter.
It's about the perspective and the core gameplay loop, not the window dressing.
Exactly. And then within these big, broad categories, we start to see these more specialized areas pop up, which we call subgenres.
Right. So like under action, you'd have stuff like platformers and fighting games and shooters, all sorts of variations.
And it gets even more interesting because sometimes the lines get kind of blurry. You might have a game that pulls elements from multiple genres.
Oh, absolutely. Especially nowadays, developers are getting really creative with blending different mechanics.
So where should we even begin with all this?
Well, why don't we start with one of the most fundamental genres, action.
Okay, action. Sounds pretty straightforward. What's the gist of that?
I think the easiest way to think about action games is they really emphasize physical challenges. Things that test your hand-eye coordination, your reaction time, and those raw motor skills.
It's like you're directly in control of the action that's happening on screen, and it has to be happening in real time.
Exactly.
I mean, this is where a lot of those classic arcade games came from, right? The ones where you had to be quick on the draw, literally.
Yeah. Action games have always been this huge part of gaming history. And they still are today. I mean, the genre encompasses anything that throws those kinds of immediate physical challenges at you.
Right, right. So within this action umbrella, what are some of the main types of games we see?
Well, let's start with platform games.
Platformers. Okay, those are all about jumping and climbing, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
You're navigating these environments, which are usually very vertical, by leaping between platforms. And it's all about mastering those jumps, timing, distance, all of that.
Yeah, and sometimes you're dodging enemies while you're doing it or navigating these crazy obstacles, or sometimes it's just pure jumping skill, like a spatial puzzle almost.
Exactly. And a lot of times the characters have these like almost superhuman jumping abilities. They can leap these incredible distances and heights. And you as the player have a certain amount of control even while they're in the air. Yeah. Like those little mid-air adjustments.
Exactly. It's crucial for those precise landings.
And I've always noticed how these games really play with verticality. Like everything's about going up or not falling down. It's like they're built on these like towering, uneven landscapes.
It's a signature element of the genre, that exaggerated verticality.
So where did this all begin? What are some of the first platformers?
Well, one of the earliest and most iconic is Donkey Kong from 1981. It's funny, actually, because when it first came out, the gaming press in America was calling it a climbing game.
Climbing game?
Yeah, which makes total sense when you think about it. Dodging barrels and scaling that construction site.
Totally fits. And then just a few years later, you have Super Mario Bros.
Yeah.
In 1985. I mean, that game was a total phenomenon. Sold millions upon millions of copies.
Absolutely. Super Mario Bros. Was a huge step for the genre. It really established the template for so many games that came after it.
A true classic. Okay, so moving from jumping to, well, shooting. What about shooter games? Right, shooter games. These are all about using ranged weapons. The action usually takes place at a distance, between you and whatever you're trying to hit.
Right, right. So lots of guns and projectiles and whatnot.
Exactly. But it's important to note that not all shooters are violent. There are games like Splatoon where you're shooting paint or ink, and the goal isn't necessarily to harm anyone.
Ah, right. So it's the act of shooting that defines the genre, not the intent. Interesting distinction.
Precisely. And then within shooter games, you can break it down further by perspective. You have first-person shooters or FPS, where you see the world through the eyes of your character.
Right, like you're literally holding the gun.
Yep. And these often have what's called a HUD, or heads-up display, that shows you your health, ammo, that kind of stuff.
Essential info.
Then you have third-person shooters, where you see your entire character on screen, and the environment is rendered from a more distant viewpoint.
Okay, so you can see the whole scene, including your character.
Right. And there are even games that let you switch between these perspectives.
Ooh, that's cool. Adds a whole other layer of strategy.
Absolutely. And then there's this newer category that's become really popular, hero shooters.
Hero shooters, those are the ones with, like, specific characters, each with their own abilities, right?
Yeah. So instead of creating just, like, a generic soldier, you choose from a roster of pre-designed heroes, each with their own unique weapons and skills, and they can't be changed mid-match.
So it's about mastering a particular hero and their playstyle.
Exactly. And it really emphasizes teamwork, because you need to coordinate with your teammates, figure out how different heroes' abilities can work together.
It's more about strategy and synergy than just raw skill.
Right. And this whole concept actually drew inspiration from the MOBA genre, which we'll talk about later, as well as earlier team-based shooters like Team Fortress 2.
Makes sense. So some popular examples would be like Overwatch, Paladins, Apex Legends, things like that.
Yeah, those are all big ones.
Definitely heard of those. Okay, what other types of shooters are out there? You mentioned something about light gun shooters.
Ah, yes. Light gun shooters. You know the ones where you use a controller shaped like a gun? They have a light sensor that tracks where you're aiming on screen. It's a technology that's actually been around for a while.
Oh, yeah. I remember those from arcades. You'd hold this big plastic gun. So nostalgic.
They're classic. And then there are shoot-'em-ups.
Oh, yeah. Shoot 'em ups. Those always looked crazy intense.
They can be. Usually you're piloting a vehicle like a spaceship or plane, and you're constantly battling these huge waves of enemies.
Like you're flying through a storm of bullets.
Pretty much. It's all about maneuvering to avoid getting hit while also dishing out damage. It's a real test of your reflexes.
No wonder shooter games have been so popular for so long, especially first-person shooters. I mean, they've been dominant since the 90s, right?
That's right. A lot of people point to Wolfenstein 3D from 1992 as a game that really helped establish the genre. It pioneered a lot of the core mechanics and even the visual style that we still see today.
A true trendsetter.
Absolutely. And then just a year later, the same developers, id Software, released Doom.
Ah, Doom, a legendary game.
Truly. And it had a huge impact on the entire industry.
It's crazy to think how influential a single game can be.
And beyond those early titles, you have these incredibly successful and long-running series like Half-Life, which was really groundbreaking in terms of its story and gameplay, and then, of course, Call of Duty, which is just this massive commercial juggernaut.
Yeah, those franchises are icons for a reason. Okay, so we've looked at jumping, shooting from afar. What about getting up close and personal? Fighting games.
Perfect transition. Fighting games. All about that direct, close-quarters combat. Usually one-on-one, but sometimes it's a small group of fighters.
Right, like those classic arcade face-offs.
Exactly. Lots of punches, kicks, special moves. And most fighting games have this big roster of characters to choose from, each with their own unique fighting style.
Yeah, and they often draw inspiration from real martial arts, right?
Oh, absolutely. You'll see moves and stances from karate, kung fu, wrestling, all sorts of things. And there's usually a strong focus on competitive multiplayer in these games.
Right, because it's all about skill and outmaneuvering your opponent.
Exactly. Now, most fighting games focus on hand-to-hand combat, but there are some, like Soul Calibur and Samurai Showdown, where you can use weapons.
Right. So swords and staffs and all that.
Exactly.
It feels like fighting games were just everywhere for a long time. Arcades, consoles, everywhere. You mentioned they were super dominant until the late 90s and then saw a bit of a dip. What happened there?
Yeah, they were definitely king for a while. But that dip was pretty short-lived, to be honest. The genre never really went away.
Makes sense. Those core franchises like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Tekken, those are still going strong.
Absolutely. And then you have the more recent Super Smash Bros., which has also become incredibly popular.
Right, and Smash always felt a bit different from those other fighting games.
Yeah, it's definitely its own thing. It kind of intentionally broke some of the traditional fighting game rules. It's much more focused on fun and accessibility than, like, hardcore competitive play.
Okay, I could see that. So moving from one-on-one combat to, well, what about when you're facing a whole horde of enemies? Like a one-man army situation.
Ah, you're talking about beat-em-up games, sometimes called brawlers.
Yeah, beat 'em ups, those are all about, like, plowing through tons of bad guys.
That's the gist of it. So instead of fighting just a few tough opponents, you're taking on these large groups of weaker enemies, and you're usually moving through levels as you do it.
Like you're clearing out the streets one goon at a time.
Exactly. And beat 'em ups often borrow mechanics from other action genres. And they frequently have co-op multiplayer, so you can team up with a friend.
Oh, yeah. Tag teaming against the bad guys.
Exactly. Now, they did see a bit of a decline in the early 90s when fighting games were really taking off, but they're still around. And there's a subgenre called hack and slash that focuses on weapon-based combat against those big enemy groups.
Okay, so we've covered direct confrontation, but what about a more subtle approach? What about sneaking around and staying hidden?
Ah, you're talking about stealth games.
Stealth games, yeah. Those are all about avoiding detection, right?
Exactly. It's about being sneaky, using the environment to your advantage, and generally trying to stay out of sight.
Like a ninja.
Precisely. And while you might have the ability to fight if you're discovered, a lot of stealth games will actually penalize you for it. They want you to stay hidden.
Right, because the challenge is all about avoiding those direct confrontations.
Exactly. Think of classic series like Metal Gear or Sly Cooper.
Yeah, great example. So it's all about being quiet, unseen, and really using your surroundings to stay hidden.
Exactly. Now, some games incorporate stealth elements, but that doesn't automatically make them a stealth game.
Right, because a game like Skyrim has sneaking, but you can totally just run in and fight everyone if you want.
Right. Exactly. It's not the defining feature of the game.
So what was the first stealth game?
Well, it's believed to be a game called Manbiki Shonen, which translates to shoplifting boy. Yeah. Released in Japan in 1979.
Wow, that's going way back.
It is. And it was a pretty obscure title. But the first mainstream stealth game that really popularized the genre was Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear. And one of the key design choices there was that your character starts the game completely unarmed.
Oh, wow. That definitely forces you to be stealthy.
Right. You have no choice but to rely on avoiding enemies. And it went on to sell over 1 million copies in the U.S.
So influential.
And then the sequel, Metal Gear 2, Solid Snake, really expanded on the stealth gameplay. They both really helped define the genre.
Yeah. It's incredible how some games can just spawn these whole new genres.
Absolutely. And then in 1996, Metal Gear Solid came out. And that was the first 3D stealth game. It really brought the genre to a whole new level, both visually and mechanically. And a lot of people credit it with popularizing the whole hiding behind cover thing.
That's a huge legacy for one series.
It is.
Okay, so moving from sneaking around to, well, what about just trying to stay alive in a harsh environment?
Ah, you're talking about survival games.
Survival games, yeah. What's the core of that genre?
Well, survival games are all about, well, surviving. They usually throw you into this hostile, often open world environment, and you start with very little in terms of resources.
Sounds rough.
Can be. The whole gameplay loop revolves around gathering resources, crafting tools and weapons, building shelter, and just generally managing your basic needs like hunger and thirst.
It's like a constant struggle against the elements and whatever else is out there.
Exactly. And a lot of survival games feature what's called procedurally generated environments.
Which means?
Means the world is different every time you play. It's randomly generated, so it adds a lot of replayability.
That's cool. So every playthrough is unique. And you mentioned that sometimes survival games can overlap with horror.
Yeah, if the setting involves supernatural threats, or like a zombie apocalypse, then it becomes survival horror.
Makes sense. Okay, let's switch gears completely and talk about something a bit more, well, rhythmic.
You mean rhythm games?
Rhythm games, yeah. All about timing and hitting the beat.
Exactly. Rhythm games are usually music-themed, and they challenge you to move or press buttons in sync with the music. Think of games like Dance Revolution or Guitar Hero.
Classics. I remember spending hours in the arcade trying to master DDR.
Those are great examples. The game will usually visually cue you on what to do, and then you get points based on your accuracy and timing. And a lot of people consider Parappa the Rapper to be the first truly influential rhythm game. It really set the formula for a lot of the games that came after it.
Kick, punch, it's all in the mind. Classic Parappa.
And there are just so many variations out there. You have games like Mai, Project Diva, Tekken no Tatsujin, Crypt of the Necrodancer. It's a really diverse genre.
Yeah, it's amazing how many different ways you can use music and rhythm to create a fun and challenging game.
It really is.
Okay, so one last stop in the action realm before we move on. You mentioned a newer genre that's become a huge phenomenon, Battle Royale games.
Ah, yes. Battle Royale.
Those are the ones where it's like everyone for themselves, last player standing wins.
Exactly. Yeah. It's basically a combination of survival, exploration, scavenging for resources, and then that really intense last man standing gameplay.
So you drop into a map, usually with a ton of other players, and then you have to scrounge for weapons and gear and just try to outlast everyone else.
You got it. And to add to the tension, the safe zone is constantly shrinking, so you're forced into closer and closer encounters as the game progresses.
Oh, wow. So you can't just hide forever. You eventually have to fight.
Right, and some of the most popular games in the world right now are battle royales. Games like PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, Fortnite Battle Royale, Apex Legends, and Call of Duty. Warzone.
Yeah, those are massive. It's crazy how quickly this genre has become so popular.
It really is.
Okay, let's just take a moment to breathe and think about everything we've covered so far. I mean, even just within the action genre, there's so much variety, so many different types of experiences.
It really shows you how broad and diverse the world of gaming is.
It does. But we're just getting started, right? What happens when you start to mix those action elements with things like exploration, puzzle solving, and maybe even some deeper storytelling?
Well, that leads us to the next big genre, action-adventure games.
Ah, the genre blender. What's the magic formula for an action-adventure game?
Well, it's kind of in the name, right? It's all about combining elements from both action and adventure games.
So you have like the immediate challenges of combat or platforming, but also these longer-term goals and objectives.
Exactly. You'll often have to find and use specific tools or items that you collect on your journey. There's usually a lot of exploration involved, puzzle solving, combat, and sometimes a really intricate story to follow.
So it's not just about quick reflexes, it's about using your brain too.
Absolutely. And interestingly, action-adventure has become this kind of catch-all term for games that don't fit neatly into any other genre.
Right, because some games just have a little bit of everything.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that because action-adventure is so dominant on consoles nowadays, a lot of people just call those games adventure games, which can be a bit confusing if you're talking about genres in a more formal way.
Yeah, the lines can get blurred for sure.
They can. So, in terms of history, one of the early influential action-adventure games was simply titled Adventure, and it was released for the Atari 2600 in 1980. And what's really interesting is that it was actually inspired by a text-based adventure game called Colossal Cave Adventure.
Wow, that's fascinating. So they took this game that was all text and figured out how to make it work with a joystick and visuals.
Exactly. The designer basically had to invent a new genre just to adapt this text-based game to the limitations of the Atari 2600.
That's so cool.
It really is. But the genre really solidified, I think, with the release of The Legend of Zelda in 1986. It was a massive success, and it really blended all these different elements together.
Oh yeah, Zelda was a game changer. What made it so special?
Well, it had this huge world to explore, transport puzzles to solve, inventory-based puzzles, action-based combat, a simple economic system, and even some simplified RPG elements. And all of that without the traditional experience points and leveling up that you'd see in a true RPG.
Yeah, Zelda just felt different from everything else at the time.
It did. It was also one of the first examples of open-world, nonlinear gameplay, giving players a lot of freedom in how they approach the game. And it introduced things like battery backup saving, which was a pretty big deal back then.
Yeah, being able to save your progress without having to start over every time was huge.
Huge. And Zelda went on to be incredibly influential, not just on other action-adventure games like Metroid, but also on early console RPGs like Final Fantasy.
It really left its mark on the entire industry.
It did. And of course, the Zelda series itself is still going strong today. It's become this iconic franchise that continues to push the boundaries of the action-adventure genre.
So action-adventure is all about finding that balance between those immediate action challenges and the longer-term goals of exploration, puzzle solving, and often a compelling narrative. But what happens when you take that sense of adventure and exploration and then inject a whole lot of fear and tension into the mix?
You're talking about survival horror.
Survival horror, yeah. The genre that's all about keeping you on the edge of your seat.
Exactly. Survival horror games are all about scaring the player. They use classic horror tropes, things like creepy atmospheres, themes of death and decay, encounters with monsters, and often pretty graphic violence.
Definitely not for the faint of heart.
No, definitely not. And a key element of a lot of survival horror games is that resources are intentionally scarce. You might have very limited ammo for your weapons, or your weapons might break after a few uses.
So you can't just go in guns blazing. You have to be really careful.
Exactly. It makes every encounter much more tense because you know that every bullet counts.
Right. And some of the most famous examples of survival horror are Silent Hill and Resident Evil.
Those are definitely two of the biggest names in the genre. They're masters at creating that atmosphere of dread and vulnerability.
There really are. What about the origins of this particular blend genres? Where did it all begin?
Well, the first game that most people consider to be survival horror is actually called AX2, Uchu Yususen Nostromo, which translates to AX2, Alien Transport Ship Nostromo. It was developed by a student in Japan and released there in 1981.
Based on the movie Alien.
That's right.
Makes sense given the themes and atmosphere of that film.
It does.
Okay, so speaking of games that blend genres in really interesting ways, let's talk about Metroidvania games.
Metroidvania. Love that term. It's so descriptive.
It really is. So what makes a game a Metroidvania? What are the key ingredients?
Well, it's a subgenre of platformer, and it gets its name from the Metroid and Castlevania series. The defining features are these big, interconnected world maps that you can explore, but access to certain areas is restricted. You need to find specific tools, weapons, or abilities to open up new areas.
So it's like you're constantly unlocking new parts of the world as you progress.
Exactly. And those new abilities not only let you overcome tougher enemies and obstacles, but they also let you discover shortcuts and find hidden secrets. And it often means you have to backtrack to areas you've already been to.
Right, like you come back to a place with a new item and suddenly you can reach areas you can't before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a really rewarding feeling. And Metroidvanias typically don't follow a strict linear path. They encourage you to explore and go back and forth as you gain new powers.
Yeah, the world really feels interconnected in those games.
It does.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here in the action realm. We've talked about platformers, shooters, fighting games, beat-em-ups, stealth games, survival games, even rhythm games and battle royales.
It's amazing how much variety there is within a single genre.
It is. But now, let's go back to the roots, so to speak. Let's talk about the pure adventure genre.
Adventure games. Some of the earliest video games out there.
Yeah. I mean, this is where it all began, right?
It is, and a lot of people point to Colossal Cave Adventure from the 1970s as one of the very first. It was originally just called Adventure, and it was a text-based game. No graphics, just words on a screen.
So how did you even play it?
You would type in commands on your keyboard. Things like go north, take sword, open door, and the computer would describe what happened as a result of your actions.
Wow, that's so different from how we play games today.
It is. But that was really the foundation of the adventure genre.
So as technology advanced, things obviously changed. What happened next?
Well, as computers got more powerful, graphics started to appear. And eventually, those text-based descriptions were replaced with actual images.
So you could finally see the world you were exploring.
Yeah, exactly. Early graphic adventures still often used text input, but then the mouse became popular, and that led to the development of the point-and-click interface. So instead of typing in commands, you would just click on things on the screen to interact with the game world.
Ah, that's much more intuitive.
It is. Now, it's important to note that adventure, as a game genre, isn't really about the specific story or content. It's more about the gameplay style.
Okay, I'm listening.
Adventure games generally don't have a lot of reflex-based challenges or fast-paced action. The focus is on solving puzzles and interacting with the game's environment and characters.
So it's more about using your brain than your reflexes.
Exactly. Figuring things out, exploring, and uncovering the story at your own pace.
And I imagine this kind of gameplay appealed to a different kind of gamer.
It did. People who enjoyed the slower pace, the problem-solving aspect.
So when did adventure games really hit the mainstream?
Well, a lot of people point to Myst from 1993 as the moment when adventure games really exploded in popularity. It became the best-selling PC game up to that point.
Oh, yeah, Myst. That was huge.
It was. And it was really innovative for its time. It had these incredibly detailed and atmospheric worlds, a very simple point-and-click interface at a pretty casual pace. And it also had this unique, almost surreal aesthetic that really drew people in.
Yeah, it was unlike anything else.
Exactly. Now, Myst did have several sequels, but none of them quite reached the same level of success as the original. And while it did inspire a lot of similar games with those surreal, atmospheric worlds, none of them really captured the same magic.
It looks like Myst was lightning in a bottle.
It kind of was. And in the late 90s, the adventure genre as a whole saw a decline in popularity. A lot of people even thought it was dead. But it wasn't really dead. It just became more of a niche genre.
So it found a smaller but still dedicated audience?
Exactly. And there were some bright spots. The Longest Journey from 1999 was a really well-received adventure game that focused heavily on story and character interaction. And there's been some renewed interest in the genre recently, particularly on platforms like Nintendo consoles.
Interesting. And you mentioned a successful crowdfunding campaign for an adventure game a few years back.
Yeah, that was Double Fine Studios' Kickstarter for Broken Age in 2012. It was a huge success, which really showed that there was still a big audience for these classic-style adventure games.
So the genre's not dead, it's just evolving.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, within the adventure genre, there are some subgenres worth talking about.
Okay, let's hear it.
First up, we have text adventures, which are the oldest form of adventure games.
Right, like those early games you mentioned where you had to type in commands.
Exactly. Think of games like Zork. They were all about using your imagination and figuring out the right words to progress the story.
So the writing was really important in those games.
Oh, absolutely. It had to be engaging and descriptive enough to really draw the player into the world.
I can see that. And then what came after text adventures?
Well, as technology advanced, graphics started to become more common. So we saw the emergence of graphic adventures, where the text descriptions were supplemented with images, and eventually those images became the primary way the game world was presented.
So you could actually see what you were interacting with.
Exactly. And these games still used text input at first, but then the mouse came along, and that led to the development of the point-and-click interface.
Right, where you would just click on things to interact with them.
Precisely. And this made the genre much more accessible to a wider audience.
Makes sense. Okay, what about visual novels? What are those all about?
Visual novels are a really interesting subgenre. They're mostly static graphics, often in a style that's kind of like anime, and they have a really strong emphasis on narrative.
So it's almost like reading an interactive book with pictures.
That's a great way to put it. And a lot of them have these branching storylines where the choices you make can lead to different endings.
Oh, that's cool. So your decisions actually matter.
They do. And visual novels are incredibly popular in Japan. They make up a huge portion of the PC game market over there.
Wow, I had no idea they were that big.
They are.
Okay, what about interactive movies? Those sound pretty self-explanatory.
They kind of are. It's basically what it sounds like.
Yeah.
You're watching a movie, but you get to make choices that affect how the story unfolds.
So it's like a choose-your-own-adventure movie.
Exactly. And they use pre-recorded video, which can be either animated or live action. And at certain points, the game will give you options for what your character should do next.
Interesting. So it's less about free exploration and more about reacting to these predetermined scenes.
Right.